presentation.
Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me. I am not a medical expert. I'm an educator. So I'm not going to refer very much to the medical side of COVID, but rather restrict myself to the educational one. So thank you for inviting me, and thank you for coming and making the time. And I hope we'll have a fruitful conversation after. I will try. I'm going to share my screen. Okay, so this is the theme I've chosen: adult education for resilience. And I think in the process it will become clear why I have focused on this word resilience. COVID-induced ponderings for practice. I'm going to do 4 things. I'm going to give some examples, start in other words with the practice, and the examples I give are Cape Town Together, the Community Action Networks, and the Food Growers Initiative. And I'll talk a little bit about some cartoons that we used for coronavirus or COVID education, and then I'll talk about vaccine literacy. I don't think I'm going to get to the problem tree. I will then suggest that we need a new normal, but before we can embark on a new normal and building back better, we need to do some stock taking, and I will just very quickly go through some of the assumptions about education and ask you which of those assumptions you think maybe we should check out. I'll then unpack resilience being one of the responses to the proposed adult education. And I will focus on one particular kind and end up with a few notes on life-affirming adult education. So let me start together with the case study of Cape Town Together, which I was and I am involved in. It was in April 2020, after we got over the initial shock of the pandemic and the associated lockdown that kept us at home, that activists and educators swung into action. And we got together and we decided that those people who had no access to sanitation, to food, to medicines, people stuck at home without being able to pursue their livelihood activities, they needed help. And in the various areas of Cape Town, and I must apologize, I am very kind of local centric in this talk. I'm talking about what I know best, but I suppose that comes from being in lockdown and we had to work where we are. So I'm not referring to other parts of Africa, not because I don't think there are very, very good initiatives there too, but just because I know this better. So a group of concerned citizens got together in their various areas and mobilized other citizens and said, what can we do to help those who need it? What was very interesting about the community action networks is that within months, they duplicated and triplicated, and within about 4 months, we had 17,000 members across Cape Town. It was a huge movement. It was like a social movement. And of course, now it has scaled down. What was interesting is that from the start, everybody said we focus on solidarity, not charity. And we focus on the local communities that we live in because the people there know best what they need most. Just in terms of the organization, each one of those community action networks is a discrete unit, if you want. You can see in this image all the different logos. Everybody made their own little logo from where they were. And it prioritized, each one prioritized relationships over bureaucracy. So there are still no structures within them. There are relationships, and the relationships worked, and the whole work, in fact, functioned on the basis of the speed of trust, as we called it. And we were calling in rather than calling out. So there wasn't a critical rejection of anybody with different views, but rather saying everybody who wants to come in must do so. Within a short time, it was very clear that food shortages and hunger had become an absolute priority. and people were starting food gardens. And out of the Cape Town Together, another initiative formed, which is called the Food Growers Initiative, run on the same principles as the cans. And they are probably the most active part of Cape Town Together now, self-organizing, becoming food secure by growing vegetables, using existing gardens, building new ones, doing guerrilla food gardening, in other words, taking over the verges outside their homes or little alleyways or whatever it might be. And there are some wonderful images of that. If you would like to learn more about it, go to Facebook and have a look at Food Growers Initiative or Cape Town Together, and it will put you there. They all work with free sharing of knowledge and resources. They share experiences. They talk about the knowledge and skills that they need to do what they do. They swap crops. They swap plants. They build structures using locally available materials, and they forge relationships. And why am I saying this? What does it have to do with education? Well, right from the outset, the Cape Town Together networks had co-learning sessions. And the co-learning sessions were collectively decided, what should we focus on, what should we talk about? Usually somebody canvassed a suggestion, then others, this was discussed and then agreed upon. And sometimes we got an expert, and a lot of the times we just shared what we had learned and what useful insights we could give to others. The CANS and the Food Growers Initiative has now become a kind of way of life. It functions organizationally through each CAN has got its own 2 or 3 administrators, and we administrators are on a WhatsApp group together, and various other projects that have arisen from this also work largely through WhatsApp groups. And as we can leave our homes, we begin to meet each other and work on other projects. So we move on with hope, we move on with energy, and just to kind of re-emphasize, all of this is volunteer work. So that is one way of engaging education and learning in the early days of COVID. We had more formal processes, if you want. Formal in the sense that we worked through, for example, we've been running a course on women's health for women in Cape Town, and we started a WhatsApp course on women's health. And we began with what was very obviously closest to us, and that is COVID and the coronavirus. And this is one of the images we used. We put it up, we sent it out by WhatsApp, and we said, so what does this have to do with the coronavirus? What does this have to do with anything, our experiences? You get an idea. It's a bunch of animals saying we can take over the streets because the people are now in their homes. And we would say, well, that's the immediate response of our COVID locked upness. Many stories were told. Many of the women shared their stories, the boredom, the anxiety, the insecurity, but also the gender-based violence that increased in the homes, the child abuse that increased in the homes as people became more insecure in terms of food, all those kind of related issues. And then we said, well, why animals? And we pointed out that, of course, the coronavirus or COVID is a zoonotic disease. In other words, it comes from animals, and we pointed out how many other diseases and pandemics were caused by animals. If we think of the Great Plague, it was communicated by rats. We know the havoc that mosquitoes cause in terms of malaria and dengue fever and so on. So why is it that animals are making us sick? And we then had to make the link between COVID and the climate crisis that is escalating and getting worse. And I believe the next Moja session is going to be on that. As we drive animals out of their habitat and restrict their habitat, they don't know where to go and they have to take over. And this is the way that we start getting ill. We also use this image and the next image to draw attention to the fact that while this may be a health pandemic, it is of course underpinned by the even bigger pandemic, and the biggest pandemic in the world is that of inequality. And this image got us talking about the politics of COVID, who is milking the COVID crisis into the dollar bucket. And that got us talking about access to, well, this year it got us talking to access to vaccinations and who produces the vaccinations, and in other words, who benefits. And I'm sure you've all seen the various statistics about how the rich have not just got richer, but very much richer, capitalizing in the real sense of the word on the health crisis in the world. So the dollar sign is the link between COVID and economics. There's example number 2. From here, we then went into mental health and other issues very closely related to the COVID crisis. The third example I want to show you is an example that from this year, we started developing, again, activists and from human rights organizations and labor organizations and all kinds of different groupings got together to start a vaccine literacy program and a manual or materials for teaching initially. And I think what was very gratifying is that they recognized early on that, in fact, they needed adult educators to help them, that a lot of this was very technical information, and the technical information had to be made accessible and understandable, and adult educators and popular educators know a little bit about how to do that. And so this transdisciplinary, trans-area work was wonderful, because it broke through all the borders of adult education being in its little silo, not related to economics, to health, to science. So we forged relationships across organizations and disciplines and areas of work. Again, it was all about building relationships. The actual process of doing the vaccine literacy process, teaching and learning, went through many stages of experimentation. We modified, we redesigned, we modified again, we ran a training of trainers. Different people had different questions. I think the interesting part here really is the biggest obstacle in many ways is still the question of how to convince anti-vaxxers that vaccinations are both safe and crucially important, a crucial part of the Ubuntu principle. But we all know that trying to change hearts and minds is probably one of the most difficult things to do in education. Okay, a little bit of a shift now. Vaccinations are protective mechanisms, and we needed to ask ourselves, how does this relate to the world outside? What kind of vaccination type activities do we undertake to protect ourselves from future infections, from future dangers, from risks? And I now want to make some suggestions about the form, no, sorry, I've just shuffled something here. Nope, sorry. Oh, okay, well, never mind. All these suggestions, I wanted to talk about, let's talk about taking stock for a moment. So the examples that I have shown you go in a way contrary to the formal forms of adult education, but also a lot of non-formal and especially skills training. And so let us ask for a moment, where are we? What are the assumptions we make about adult education and learning, and what do we maybe want to change? So what are some of the assumptions? The first one would be the belief that there's a fixed body of knowledge to be transmitted by subject-specific experts. Meanwhile, we know that knowledge is socially constructed, and meaning-making happens in processes of dialogue and questioning and reflection. Subject-specific learning is based on artificial boundaries that cut the intersections, the relationality between different knowledges. So this is not a good assumption. The second assumption is the one that the process of downloading information is the most efficient way, and it should happen in formal settings, and it should be according to preset principles. I don't really want to say very much more about that. We know that that simply isn't true. It may be the most efficient, but it may not be, it is certainly not the best way to learn. The third assumption is that real learning is a cognitive process and emotions get in the way. Well, again, learning is an embodied process. We learn with heads, hands, and hearts. We are embodied subjects. So we learn so much better when we get invited to use our whole body, all our senses. The next assumption is that real knowledge, just like science, is neutral, interest-free, objective. And again, we know that that is not true. Our interpretations of the world happen in particular contexts and within the strictures of power relations. And we need to ask whose interests are being served by the system of education, including the system of adult education. The next assumption is that learning is an individual process and it is competitive, and we are always encouraged to compete with one another. Well, we know that winner doesn't take all. Individuals shouldn't just invest in themselves, but rather through relationships make meaning and dialogue playfully with a serious intention. And this leads to much deeper insights and facilitates useful action derived from that insight. Theory and practice go hand in hand, as Ferrier said, praxis. Learning and education must be accredited. There are global standards and there are benchmarks, and I believe there are new global curricula in adult education. Well, this seems to fly in the face of our experience that people on the ground know what they really need to understand better and learn better how to do. And that's very local, and the conditions locally are different, and therefore how can we have a universal idea of what everybody must learn and how they must learn it? And of course, we need to learn skills. Well, skills learning is invested in growth, especially economic growth, but we know that that economic growth hasn't really happened, and the profits certainly haven't trickled down. So most of this isn't new, but most of it is so fixed into our system that we rarely question and challenge it. So what I would like to do, just very briefly, is pause here and say to you, what are some of the adult education practices that you do, that you are involved in, that you would not like coming back? In other words, if we are building back better, what are some of those things we should lose? And I'm going to pause here for 2 minutes. If you have a pen, jot down a few notes, or alternatively jot it into chat, and we can pick up on it a little bit later. So what would you like to ditch and lose? Okay. We'll come back to that a little bit later when we talk about the way forward and how to build back better. I want to now deal with something that is a little bit contentious, and it is the question of resilience. We keep on hearing people say we've all got to learn to be more resilient. It's meant as a praise, in fact. It's another way of saying we are bent, but we don't break. So in spite of the miseries of daily insecurity and uncertainty, precarious living for the middle and the upper classes, and the increased food insecurity, unemployment, domestic violence, shortages, hopelessness, lack of basic goods and services, threats to health and survival of the so-called 99%. We make it. We are resilient. We must just learn to adjust better, especially in the face of the climate crisis. So it seems to be that adult education should be in the service of teaching resilience or learning resilience. What does it mean? Resilience has become a buzzword, and I'm quoting Ames Greer, it's touted as a protective talisman against the effects of trauma, which individuals, communities, and whole economies are told to cultivate resilience. It's taken on the quality of moral virtue, with resourcefulness reframed as praise for one's ability to continually adapt. Well, the other day in the newspaper, somebody said, I am so tired of resilience. And the journalist Rebecca Davis said, as South Africans, we don't get to be playful or grumpy or stingy or sexy or any of 100 other options for national stereotypes. We get to be resilient, a nation of resilient little battlers, constantly picking ourselves up and dusting ourselves off after national tragedy or government scandal. Another negative voice, also picked off the social media, is I dream of never having been being called resilient again in my life. I am exhausted by strength. I want support. I want softness. I want ease. I want to be amongst kin, not patted on the back for how well I take a hit or for how many. Meanwhile, as we can see, the Gordon Institute of Business Science, they are already offering courses in improving resilience and stress management, a masterclass to complete at your own pace, so that that prickly cactus cannot pop you even if you are as fragile as a balloon. Well, let's have a look at resilience. There are many different kinds of resiliences, and the environmental sciences in particular have investigated what they mean and written about them quite a lot. So generally, in everyday language, resilience is seen as the ability to withstand or adapt to changing conditions and recover from shocks and stresses. This applies to physical structures as much as human beings in the natural environment. The capacity to bounce back is understood positively as being bent but not breaking, adapting despite adversity. And in education, it refers to skills for managing and responding to risks in an uncertain world, the development of which is understood to be the responsibility of individuals. It's a practice of self-enterprise. Become more resilient. Absorptive and restorative resilience aim at getting back to normal, that is, returning to the pre-crisis state. Absorptive resilience is the proverbial thick skin that allows individuals or systems to continue despite setbacks. Let's take a fictional Tembi as an example. She has lost her job due to the lockdown. 3 family members have fallen ill with COVID and 2 died. She cannot pay her rent, and she does not know how she will put food on the table, as she cannot leave the house and her 3 small children. She has not had enough cash to pay for the public transport to get vaccinated. The idea that she should absorb existing hardships and further risks and threats make her buckle. Across the town, there's Anna. She's managed to relocate her work to home. She has health insurance and paid off her bond. She has access to shops, and she can afford ever-climbing food prices because she has some savings. She wants to get back to normality, so her children will go back to school. She's been vaccinated twice. She's in a very different position to absorb the threat of a COVID infection. Adaptive resilience includes the many small acts that people undertake to respond to changed circumstances and ameliorate negative effects of consumption. Anna uses the internet. When she feels lonely and isolated, she calls friends and family on the phone. When her fear of COVID takes over, she Googles information to get reassured. A family member succumbs to COVID and she's referred to psychological help and trauma counseling. Many of these strategies are not available to Tembi. Data is expensive, the shops are far, the home is tiny, and she spends a lot of her energy fighting fear, especially when the children go outside to play. Adult education for adaptive resilience may look something like this. And it is, again, another course that is already on offer. It says, here's a course for your own mental health, and the topics covered include how emotional needs present themselves, how self-identity is formed and develops, the importance of balanced mental health, resilience, and how to encourage resilient thinking. So that is the adult education of the future. Adaptation is an important survival strategy, and the 99% are used to making contingency plans all the time. They hustle, they trade favors, and they support each other. But for them, the dangers are not individual capabilities, skills, knowledge that you have to learn, but much rather the conditions under which they have to survive, conditions often not of their choice and their making. In fact, offering them a course in adaptive resilience would be like a slap in the face. Popular education has taught us the importance of always examining and accounting for relations of power. We see that an apolitical use of resilience neglects to analyze the structures and processes that create vulnerabilities in the first place. Resilience cannot be divorced from context, from structural issues, from systemic conditions that cause the crises. Importantly, an uncritical acceptance of adaptive resilience may lead to adapting to changing conditions without asking whether those conditions are desirable and should be sustained, thus cementing inequalities and injustices. For example, unequal access to and quality of healthcare. We may adapt to that, but is that a good thing? Should we be labeling that as a positive survival resilience structure? Transformative resilience is a generative process involving collective action aimed at foundational change. Adult education for transformative resilience might look something like this. And this is the picture here. It's volunteers from the cans riding their bikes to deliver food, medicine, and other essentials to pensioners and sick people. So they are kind of roving ambassadors of health, of support, of mental health, plus sustenance through the food and the medications that they take around, etc. This is, again, about building relationships. This is about solidarity. They are building resilience through, if you want, human hands and human care. And they are changing the conditions that are based on the exchange, monetary exchange for favors or for services rather than human kindness and care. Finally, anticipatory resilience looks to the future. It assesses the now and it projects what might be given existing present vulnerabilities and risks. So anticipatory resilience goes very much hand in hand with transformative resilience. It says we need system change, we need to change the structures that keep us where we are. And underneath, of course, there's a whole lot of attitudinal change that has to happen along with it. So if we want adult education for resilience, I'm proposing we need adult education for transformative resilience, an education that is life-affirming. Okay, towards a life-affirming adult education, and I'm suggesting, drawing on these examples I have given, I'm suggesting a pedagogy of contingency, a pedagogy that responds to local conditions. And so what does that look like? It looks like it is emergent. It is a response to uncertainty, to chance, to conditionality. It is a pedagogy that builds on a livelihood perspective. In other words, it builds on the everyday living and the everyday work, and I do mean work also in the home, the work that involves the caring, the work that involves the reproduction, all that work that we've had to focus so much on when we were under lockdown, and that I think we became aware of for the first time, or many people became aware of what women, for example, in the home do and how hard they work every day to try and make sure that everybody is safe and clean and happy and well fed. So building on the livelihoods perspective means when is the busy time of the day? Where do people move around? What would be a good spot to meet for education? What would be a good time to meet for education? Not the time that suits me as an adult educator, but the time that suits the local population as the potential participants in the learning. A pedagogy of contingency simply accepts multiple intersecting risks, vulnerabilities. These are a given. Our world is insecure. It's never going to be secure again and certain again, not given the climate crisis, where we never know what's going to happen next. So that's what contingent means. You make a plan. You make a plan according to the conditions, and the conditions include the weather and the distance to your local health center or whatever it is. It builds on existing capabilities and capacities. It doesn't assume that people are stupid. It doesn't work on a deficit. It works on what there is, and it aims to build on that. Those are basic principles of popular education. It is holistic in approach, and holistic in the sense that it fosters learning with hand, heart, and head, but also that doesn't see things compartmentalized into the economics, environment, health, nutrition, food, all of those kinds of things, but they all intersect. And just as much as the risks intersect and pile up one on top of the other one, this one addresses all the factors. And it is informed by a belief in the commons and a belief in social justice as the basis of education work. Finally, then, a few ideas on life-affirming adult education. A life-affirming adult education utilizes many different approaches and tools, and it appeals to all the channels of learning and communication, head, heart, and hand. So in other words, it's built on the pedagogy of contingency. It recognizes that we are not just workers and parents and caretakers, but also imaginative beings, creative beings that can produce original products of our ingenuity and creativity. It is astonishing to watch how people are clearing the walkways between shacks, for example, and the rubbish and the weeds and everything, and then just turn that into a thriving vegetable garden with so much ingenuity and creativity and so much fun too. And therefore, it uses the arts to tap into creativity we all have, so we reveal ourselves as fully human. Being fully human isn't just a worker bee. A life-affirming adult education generates dialogical spaces. As subjects, we listen and talk, we respond and question, we explore together, we have new insights generated by the different viewpoints of the others. We emerge as different kinds of people with new ideas. A life-affirming adult education does not ask us to continuously confront deed matter, with all due apologies to all the writers, but a lot of the books and the manuals that we use are pretty dusty. They were written a long time ago when conditions were very, very different. But instead, why not go out into nature, for example, and learn from that again? Our forefathers used and mothers used to do that. So why don't we learn from indigenous people people? Why don't we learn from women? Why don't we learn from rural people who are so much more part of the living world to learn resilience from them, for example, make them our teachers. Life affirming means that we respect other ways of knowing and forms of knowledge, and I've already just given the examples. It's a collective process. It's not just an individual journey undertaken in competition with others. It forges relationships of care and support towards solidarity. And finally then, oops, I've done it again. Finally then, I just want to remind you the real disaster underpinning COVID, or the accumulating risk factors and dangers, is the ever-growing pandemic of inequalities. Education is the point at which we decide whether we love the world enough to assume responsibility for it, and by the same token, save it from that ruin, which, except for renewal, except for the coming of the new and the young, would be inevitable. Hannah Arendt. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that insightful input, Astrid. And I think our guests would agree that it was quite insightful. You took us from how we responded and reacted to COVID, how the health crisis highlighted certain inequalities and deepened the question of inequality, and how then the politics of it, the rich got richer when there's a crisis, and the poor in effect got poorer. And then of course there's the question of adult education. What is expected of adult education? So what are the assumptions made regarding how we should respond? And then you highlighted also the questions of what should be the role of adult education. In this sense, we say it must be transformative, and that is what's been happening. And of course, then lastly, making a proposal of the livelihood of that we must take into account people's livelihood when we do education, where we do it, how we do it, what we do. And we could see throughout this process how innovative people have become, especially, and one would assume that this resilience that's been built, whether it's a word that we like or not, and what does it mean for different? And also then there's a question that you pose is, what would we like to lose as adult educators? You know, some of us like to stand in a classroom. Some of us actually enjoy this online virtual facilitating, and some of us really miss the contact. And so we would like you to, as participants in this conversation, to respond to some of the input that Astrid has made, and maybe while you reflected on the question that she posed. I see that we have a variety of people. You have your academics here, and you have your informal educators here. And so I'm opening it up for questions and comments. Lindia, if are we able to open it up?
Hi, yes, we have opened it up.
Yeah. If there's any questions.
Hello? Hello, do you hear me?
Yes.
I hear you. Just
Yes,
introduce yourself.
Yeah, I'm sorry, Janja from you. I really appreciate that constructive session. But I also feel that especially during the COVID time, it has brought us another problem whereby we no longer associate.
We're losing you.
Yeah.
Yeah. Hello. We lost you again, Dr. Zali Mbike. Can I come back to you and then I just take Vanessa's hand so long? Vanessa, unmute yourself.
Morning, everyone. Thank you so much for that presentation, Astrid.
Sorry about that. We no longer. Hello.
Zali's
Hello.
back.
Okay, let's see if we can hear her.
Okay.
Hi, doctor. We can't hear you. Okay, she's gone again. Go ahead, Vanessa.
I am from WeGo, Women in Informal Employment, Globalizing and Organizing, and I'm part of the Organization and Representation Program. A colleague of mine, Laura Murillo, who's based in Germany, is also in this conversation. And for the workers in the informal economy that we work with, what, in addition to highlighting the inequalities, our observation is that it has also raised a lot of consciousness.
Yeah.
This COVID period, and the immediate displacement and threaten their livelihoods, because the livelihoods are already very precarious. And when COVID came along, whatever little savings they had was just taken up in a matter of days, because it was also very early in the year. So people had used what savings they had accumulated up until then to pay school fees and all the rest of that. And so suddenly there was this threat of no more work, but also no sense of where, how you're gonna survive. Yeah. So it's very interesting. So that there was that consciousness raising, and for me, as working on workers' education and raising and being about building power, the question that comes to mind is how do we seize that? How do we seize this moment for greater empowerment? How do you? I'm not getting the words out clearly now, but now that consciousness has been raised, when we talk about building back better, it's how to work with that. And we're definitely seeing that informal workers are feeling, despite that initial feeling of just being defeated and deflated, with that heightened consciousness is a greater awareness and a greater push for the struggle of to be identified as workers and to demand better recognition and better benefits. Workers are talking where they would not talk in the terms of demands before. It's becoming stronger and stronger, and so yeah, I think this is just like a comment to say that this moment has also presented that. Yeah. The consciousness raising, and so in terms of this transformative resilience, how do we seize the moment to build back, but to build back powerfully with a consciousness of struggle and greater struggle, where within contexts where that might not have been the case before.
I think in the cans, if I may, just a very short comment, in the cans, what was very interesting is that we use this opportunity to create little videos sometimes and disseminate a lot of information about people like informal traders, about the people at the street corner, who's selling the kind of jokes or the magazines, because we had a kind of captive audience of an upper middle class neighborhood. And nobody ever, tells them about the reality of those people at the street corner, or the people who they don't even see because they have their stalls by the roadside. And it was a fantastic moment of actually just creating awareness about other people's livelihoods and ways of being. And I suppose because the middle classes were very much in front of their computer, it was a good opportunity to just rub some of these things into their eyes and their minds. And this idea that people are just helpless. They're not helpless. They make a plan all the time. They are contingent. They are resilient already, and we can learn a lot from them.
Okay, thank you, Astrid, for that. Dr. Zalia, are you back? Do we have any other questions or comments on Astrid's input? I see a comment from, yes, Dr. Zalia, are you back?
Yeah, Dr. Zali, I was commending for Professor's session, but I was also saying that, you hear me?
Yes,
I hear.
Hello?
Yes, you're clear.
But I was also adding on that because of COVID, the close relationship that we have with our communities is somehow disintegrated to an extent that when you were mixing with them, they sometimes have a feeling that maybe for you have brought in COVID. I think there is need to assure our communities that we are together with them, for the very fact that we learn from them, especially the academicians. People down in the community feel we are super above them, and yet we are not. So there is a need for us to further work on our relationship, to further go down on the ground so that they feel comfortable with us, they get confidence with us, they have confidence that we have read books. But then we lack that intertwine of mingling with them at a free level, whereby they can give out the knowledge they have without being timid. They are assured that we are also learning from them, much as they get from us, but we are learning from them, we are planning with them, we appreciate already the knowledge they have, because mark you, we build on that knowledge which they have, we build on it. But thank you so much. Is there a chance of getting this paper? Sorry, my network was really bad. I'm from Uganda.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Zali. And I think in terms of that, Astrid can maybe just respond, and specifically on the CAN network, whether it was seen as a community-driven project or response, or was it seen as a top-down kind of a response where middle class got involved of how to respond to the crisis and the shortages and so on. Yeah, so maybe Astrid can respond to that.
Okay, it's a bit of both. So a lot of the CANs who are still very active now are the ones that were really bottom up. And very often it was around food issues and community kitchens and expansion of existing community kitchens or multiplication of community kitchens. And so those ones are very strong, and they're still actively working now. I think like the CAN I was in, because I lived in a middle class white area, I've since moved, but we had a partner CAN, and the partner CAN was in a much poorer community. So it was a kind of unequal relationship. So the local people would inform us, what their needs are. So in a way, their needs were identified, And the real work of distribution and forging relationships in the community happened locally. But I think we tried to feed back into the constituency, because it was also one way of trying to get more donations. You know, it was very instrumental. It was saying, well, we recognize that we are better off. And people were pretty good. I mean, right down to kind of having houses repaired and repairing a whole creche where the roof flew off, and donating stuff. But, you know, then the donation fatigue set in. So, so the long answer, but you know what was very interesting is that all the different CAN administrators would get together and say, we're experiencing this fatigue, what can we do about it? How can we mobilize? Okay. And I think what I didn't talk about is some of the other actions that happened between, for example, CAN administrators. We made a cookbook, which is called not just a cookbook. It's a book that has recipes for mass cooking, but it also has, if you want, recipes for organizing. And that involved meeting in person. So it was really transgressing borders and boundaries, but I think that worked best when we actually worked on a hands-on project, like a garden or the cookbook or an outing on bicycles.
Okay.
Well, thank you. And Astrid, there's just
and
a comment.
Could even be a garden book.
Sorry?
Come again?
It could be a garden book.
The garden book? No, there isn't a garden book. There's just the book.
Yeah.
I try and send the link into the chat. Let me call it up.
Yeah. I think I saw the article that you and Shirley wrote.
Yeah.
On that, yeah. So maybe that you should share. In the chat, Ivor just posed a question, and I think it's just jumping around a bit. He says, I like the idea of a pedagogy of contingency. Could you say something about how such a pedagogy challenges power and power relations? And I think this is also, in a sense, linking to what we said, the food gardens. Is it a top-down or is it a bottom-up approach? If you can respond to that, Astrid.
Well, I got to the contingency, the pedagogy of contingency, I suppose, when we were working. Let me give an example. We were working, making plays. We decided that the people who are kind of most vulnerable in a way don't come to adult education classes because they cannot afford the transport or the time or whatever. So we thought, well, if they can't come to us, we must go to them. And we'd made a play about tuberculosis. And well, in fact, two different plays. The one was made with care workers who going from house to house helping people take their medication, and the other one was made with a group of performers. But we performed in the street, we performed in shopping centers, we performed at many different sites, in neighborhoods. People would just kind of, cordon off the area, and then it was a very short play. And then after performance, the performers would mingle with the crowd and stimulate dialogue. Now, that's a good example of pedagogy of contingency. It uses the place where people are, it uses the time where people get together. It would be very often late afternoon when people coming home. They wouldn't have to spend money to come there, but the important thing is that they would talk to each other. And in neighborhoods, people often say that, they talk to their neighbor. It's the first time they've talked to their neighbor and they talked about a common problem. So it was very much kind of bottom up in the sense that it took an issue, like a health issue, like tuberculosis, and it gave scientific information in a very accessible and very entertaining way. But it then stimulated this discussion. And ironically, I mean, we distributed masks, and we got people to paint the masks and made them, colorful. So I mean, with hindsight, it was quite ironic. So it's about when it suits people, where it suits people, on topics that have to do with people's reality.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks, Astrid. Just in terms of your question that you posed, and I think and our responses are different. I just want to read some of the responses. Vanessa said it's being restricted to facilitating workshops in brick and mortar venues where learning happens is significant. And you just made an example of learning and demonstration. Comrade Mara Geduld said it's mine is more academic, but she didn't continue. So maybe she can tell us when she said, what does it mean to her? What she mean when she said more academic? And then Mary Kulabako said, sticking to specific design curriculum. This must be avoided. Learning should be based on the prevailing needs at the time. So those are a few comments in terms of what you said, what must come back, what must be buried, and what should we, I suppose, reinvent in terms of learning. So if you want to respond, if Mary Geduld can maybe continue on her question when she said it was more academic, what did she mean about that? Mara Geduld, apologies.
Afternoon, everyone. Good morning, everyone. Can you hear me?
Good morning. Yes, we can hear you.
Okay. When I say academic, is that I'm in a community learning center where we only offer academic work and not much of non-formal training. That is what I meant by that.
Yeah.
Okay.
So in order for us to introduce all of these, what is the word now? I'm looking for a word. But to introduce non-formal, we have to go out to the communities and the community learning centers. We are actually busy with that, but it hasn't started off in the Western Cape as such as to work with the communities. That is my input. Thank you.
Okay. Astrid, do you want to respond to some of the comments?
Well, I mean, I agree. I think, but I mean, the community learning, it's such a pity that the community learning centers like yours, Mara, that they aren't a hub. That isn't a place yet where people come. So, you know, I sort of have this idea that because it's a very beautiful one, for example, it's very well structured. So if people came there and said, hey, there's this pandemic and we'd like to really learn about it. And there would be a way of responding and saying, sure, you know, where should we do it? And we can do it outside. We can sit in the parking lot or whatever. So it doesn't have to, we don't have to have, you know, provision of data. But there should be a much more engaged way of saying, okay, so if, you know, if let's say, if there's a gender-based violence incident in the community, let's go to our community learning center. Let's talk about it here. What do we need to learn? Why it happens? You know, let's explore it. So there needs to be a much more engaged process of educators who say, okay, I don't know about it either. Let's do it together. I know where to find something or who to call on or whatever. Yeah.
Okay. I have Ferrell. Ferrell, do you have a question?
Well, thanks, Griselda, and morning, everybody. I was just wanting to latch on to what Mara was saying. In part, Astrid has addressed that she's, of course, Astrid has experience in over a couple of years of engaging with the community learning centers when we went around the country, trying to introduce non-formal popular education approaches. And in fact, just last week, and Mara will get updates more of that later, we were in Johannesburg with officials from the department, from national and provinces. But the point to be made here is exactly as Astrid raises, it's a bit of a pity, to say the least, that they aren't ready, so to speak, to support and work with communities around many of the issues, especially at this time. But of course, we underline that point, you know, very strongly. And we, by the way, Astrid shared the toolkit that you wrote, you know, around popular education and community learning centers. And I think, of course, would be very useful for others as well. And maybe we should share that. But I think it's also on the Moja website, so people can go there by way of an advert. And I think, you know, we need to up the pace. And that's the point we were making with, you know, with the people from the DHET, Department of Higher Ed, that exactly we need to see CLCs and colleges, community colleges, linked more directly and deliberately with communities. One or two were very open to that and immediately said, yes, we realize we are disconnected. So I think it is about making connections, in ways, of course, that expand what Astrid's presented in the CANS experience. So thanks. I just wanted to raise that as well.
Yeah. No, thank you, Pharaoh. I think, in the field that we also in, it seems that the more things change, the more they stay the same. There's too much bureaucracy and administrative instead of getting the work done and being able to reach out to the communities that we like. I just want to touch on the question of resilience. What do you think? What do you think of the concept that Astrid has introduced, that we must just be resilient and forge ahead and do what needs to be done? And whether things are bad, and if you survive it, then you're such a resilient person. What did you think of that concept that Astrid raised? Pharaoh, is your hand still up, or was it an old hand?
In more ways than one, it's an old hand, Griselda. Let me just try and take it down. Clearly, I'm not the technocrat that people might like. Sorry.
I heard so, yeah, I heard so. Are there any questions or comments?
Can I just make another comment about it? I mean, when, in the days of Donald Trump, people kind of survived and they became hardened and they developed a thick skin. So, if resilient is a good thing, they became resilient. But the question is whether that was a good resilience. So I think we become resilient to all kinds of things. We make allowances for all kinds of things. It's like Rebecca Davis's comment that we in South Africa are such resilient little strugglers. So we'll have one catastrophe after the other. And that comment was made after the Durban looting incidents. So something happens and then we say, oh, well, let's move on. So resilience isn't always a good thing. And I think that the resilience we need really is a transformative one that says, if we want to survive with the climate crisis, we've got to change things. We've got to change them in a big way.
Yeah, I'm just wondering, Astrid, in terms of this, from who is it expected to be more resilient than others? In most instances. Hello.
You hear me?
Yeah, who's speaking?
Yeah, this is Dr. Majanja, Uganda.
Okay.
Much as resilient is not always positive, but in my own view, resilient supports persistence. So in most cases, I think you have to apply them together to get out something positive. That is my own view.
Thank you.
Okay. Are there any other comments? I can't see.
If I may, Griselda, I don't know why I can't put my hand up.
Okay.
I must say that this concept of resilience is also troubling me a little bit. I think it's because I have just for the last year, I have looked at what I now call the pluriverse of hope and possibility.
I'm losing you.
COVID has suddenly.
Ivor, you've disappeared.
Ivor.
And it's almost as if these. Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you now. We lost you a bit.
Yeah, I was just saying that I have now started to look over the last year at all these practices and innovations, and I think
Yeah, network.
Ivor?
there where lots of community.
Ivor, we're losing you.
Peri-urban KZN network is not great where I think is located now. Maybe you should put the note there if it's going to happen repeatedly. Sorry, Ivor.
Yeah, let me try and try because I think I have a bad connection.
Mm. Yeah. So while I was typing, it's just Namubura. Zulu said, I like the different types of resilience. We usually focus on adaptive, yet sometimes it's impossible. I come from a trade union background, and it's always said that we're more reactive than to situations instead of pre-planning. And in a way, I feel that this is what we're doing now. We're more reactive to a crisis than what we are prepared. And I think this taught us the lesson, because many people have decided they're not going back to formal employment. They found something else, which under normal circumstances, they would not have responded in such a way. Here is Laura Murillo, said, thank you so much, Astrid. In the case of organizations of workers in the informal economy, it was possible to see how fast they learned the use of technologies to interact with each other and to connect with organizations that were in other regions. So in a way, it's forced people also to make use of what they have around them and to use it differently. And now there's more interest to learn from other parts of the world. Absolutely. So yeah, it was a good thing. Ivor?
I think if it wasn't for data problems, we could use it so much better now, because people really have learned how to, even WhatsApp, quick learning sessions.
Short learning sessions. And I know with WeGo and StreetNet and those organizations, they have found and they are able to, and maybe Vanessa should say a little bit more about them, how they are able to communicate and have learning sessions maybe much more than what they would have had before, when we have to plan a workshop in a bricks and mortar building. Yeah, we lost Ivor, and so we don't have Ivor anymore.
I'm happy to share. In fact, there will be a piece in the next edition of the South African Labour Bulletin on how we've used the WhatsApp voice notes, and it was really it was learning from, as Esther had said, people cope, people manage. It's the crisis that brought it to the attention of those of us who live comfortable middle-class lives and don't see the day-to-day struggle and the day-to-day resilience from moment to moment. Be that as it may, people in Sierra Leone, for example, had learned enormously from the Ebola crisis. And so when COVID hit, they knew what to do immediately. And one of the things that we've learned from our comrades in the Sierra Leone organization for traders, SLETU, as a way of ensuring organizational accountability, they've always met via WhatsApp voice note, so that there was a record of the deliberations for everyone, and anyone could go back later. And it was also easier to meet in that way, because it was always difficult to come together physically. And then for us at WeGo, because we're also working within the region and, you know, working across borders, at the beginning it felt so helpless, but then just the sense of hearing someone's voice, it was first to just reach out to workers who were far away and, you know, just to show solidarity, but also to gauge how workers were feeling. And you can't really tell that from a text as clearly as you can tell from someone's voice. And so it was just, you know, inspired by that, really wanting to reach out in solidarity to comrades who were across the borders, and we knew that they were inevitably in a difficult position. But then workers started, you know, chatting to each other using voice notes. And that has brought about a new form of organizing and a new form of learning, and using that platform and in multiple ways in this one year. It's been amazing what has been possible. And you speak about data, Astrid. Yes, data is a challenge, but for me, I think it also now creates the impetus for us to struggle, and for people on the ground to struggle for access to it.
Absolutely.
Why don't we have reliable data access, especially on our continent? We are now seeing about how critical it is to have that infrastructure for day-to-day livelihood. Home-based workers want to be able to sell their products online. They need reliable infrastructure to be able to do that. So I believe, you know, it brings energy into struggling for that kind of infrastructure.
I think that's why I kept on emphasizing the importance of relationship building. You know, once you've got relationships of trust, you can fly. You can struggle for data as much as for land, as much as for food gardens. But we've got to learn that again, and it's probably the biggest breakthrough against sort of competitive individualism that we've all buckled under in the way, is to just get back to building relationships. And not instrumental ones only, you know, not exchange, human resource exchange kind of types, really relationships. Yeah.
No, I think Carol has raised what I wanted to suggest, Vanessa, that you share that information on the Moja site of how the informal workers, sector workers has done learning, and how they've done it through the WhatsApp and the WhatsApp videos, etc. And also the question of data, not only access, the cost of platforms that most people have been struggling and have been raised. So it must become a real campaign again. I think Laura Murillo said that before the pandemic, some organizations were concentrated in their own fights, but with pandemic, there was a need to see other organizations, other struggles, and see social protection, for example, as a common fight. But also what you are saying, Astrid, that the experiences and learnings on the continent was shared, and we are better to learn from each other on the continent. Sometimes we go too far out to learn and to get information from others. And and what you raise, the livelihoods perspective, that we can only learn, you know, the Paulo Freire concept, we learn from our own experiences, and that's how we should communicate. I'm just wondering if you have any closing remarks in terms of what you have proposed, in terms of how we take education forward, or if Farrell would be able to give us a short summary of what a brief response in terms of what we have all discussed here. The time is now 24 minutes past. So Farrell, if you're up to it, and Astrid, if you have a few last minute things to say, if nobody else have any comments to make.
I wouldn't want to try and summarize what Astrid has put to us. I think let's allow Astrid that if there's anything further she wants to add or pick up on. I think there was some engagement, and that was good. And then I'll just do a bit of closing comments as Iva asked me to do, if that's all right.
Yeah,
thanks.
Fine. Thank you, Pharaoh.
Maybe just one last comment, and that is about this proposal for life affirming adult education. I think education seems to have moved away from life and living, or moved into a specific area of life and living, and we've removed ourselves from nature very, very far. And unless we relearn to build a relationship, a respectful relationship with nature that is not just extractive, we're not going to survive. So I suppose for myself, I haven't wanted to talk about it because I know the next webinar is about it. But for myself, I have moved closer and closer to the paradigm of ecofeminism or ecofeminist socialism, because it actually gives me some of the tools that make sense of the kind of work in education I'm trying to do, and the kind of work that I think we need to focus on much more. We know skills development is not going to deliver equality. And we know that we need equality before we can all survive. So, all this talk about Ubuntu and loving oneself no more than the neighbor and all of that, it's got to start with respect, and it's got to start with equality. And we can learn that from nature. A lot of that is when we go for a walk and we actually open our eyes. It's extraordinary how plants share the sun and the soil, and there's a lot for us to learn. So yes, life affirming, not commodity desiring. So we've got to change the way we produce. We've got to change the way we organize. We've got to change the way we consume. But I think we'll hear much more about that when we hear about the perils of the extractivist patriarchal relations. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Astrid. Pharaoh?
Yeah, thank you also from my side, Astrid. Just for colleagues on this webinar who don't know, I'm what they call the country director for DVV International, and it is DVV who established the digital platform for colleagues not only in the 10 countries on the continent where we are located, but obviously others also who have participated. Far and wide, some from those countries and others also from certainly Germany, Finland, I see, Uganda, Tanzania, Burundi, Malawi, and then, of course, the number of South Africans who are on this platform. So the idea is to obviously engage in exchange, and exactly this opportunity was afforded through this webinar, which, as you hear, is our first for the platform. It's the digital platform is very much still in its infant stages, so to speak. There's lots being uploaded and shared, and encourage people who are not members or others that are not members to certainly use it to go and see what there is, but also to upload the good practices and experiences that exist. That is exactly the reason we thought the platform would be useful, so that we're not looking exactly the point you make, Griselda. We're not only looking, to Europe and other countries when there's so many good examples on the continent right here. So that's certainly it for us. And then also, Astrid, for asking us to think again about our views and understandings of resilience, a word very much bandied about, whether it's in the development world, as it's called, or, whether it's from donors or elsewhere. We hear about this all the time. And of course, we know people have had to be resilient. People who live and forced to the margins, they've had no choice. And I think, yes, again, COVID has highlighted how it's not only something limited to people who live on the margins. We've all had to, adapt in many ways. So that adaptive resilience certainly has been there. But also, I think for people on the margins, as we know, anticipatory resilience, the other form of resilience that Astrid refers to. People have had to anticipate, what next. It's not as with middle class people. You gave again the classic example, the juxtaposing the Thandi versus the middle class, a person who has all the support, available when times get tough. So thanks very much for that. The issues, of course, of growing inequality is something that, so they tell us South Africa is the worst example of that. So in some cases, there's much to learn from this space. Also just, and I raised it when Mara made the input about community learning centers as spaces and, for community education to be happening, but not only in those buildings and in those classrooms, the brick and mortar spaces as was referred to here, but certainly the fact that, for these community learning spaces that exist at the moment, they need to shift and change from the formal to include the non-formal and the kind of skills that is not as limited as we know. We are told it needs to be for the marketplace, a possibility of jobs that we also know don't really exist and are shrinking. So these myths and these contexts need to be opened up and thought about more and then shifted, because, and this is what we are trying to do in other ways, but let's use the platform, let's use these discussions. I'm looking forward to the next one as well, Astrid, you referred to, on ecofeminism, and let's encourage our colleagues to participate. And yeah, just to thank everyone, who have made the time to be part of this. I mean, we had a large number of people who registered, unfortunately not as many as we would have liked, here, but we will be sharing. And I know there's Facebook as well. And for those less gray-haired, maybe they are out there on the Facebook that we are not seeing right here. But Lindia will be able to tell us about that later. So again, thanks to everyone for your time and your participation. And let's keep on talking and sharing and growing, for all the reasons we work in this space. Yeah. So thanks, and thanks, Griselda, for holding it together for us. Cool.
Thank you very much, everybody, and thank you for your participation. I'm not going to repeat. Ferrell, I think I've made the summary, and he has pulled it together also as well. So thank you very much, Astrid, for getting us thinking, and for everyone sharing their experiences and how they are doing in their different countries. And in the information that came out, please share it on the Moja platform and share it with us in this group. We are looking forward to future webinars, and we wish the Moja Africa team well with all the presentations that they will have in the future. Thank you very much. Okay, can we see everybody's faces just so that they say goodbye to us all?